The U.S.-China relationship and the process of China's reform and opening up are deeply intertwined. In 1979, Deng Xiaoping initiated the first phase of reform and opening up, and he did that simultaneously with establishing formal diplomatic relations with the United States. The result for China has been 40 years of dramatic economic growth. At the same time, the U.S.-China relationship over those 40 years has been fairly cooperative and stable. The deep economic relationship fostered by China's opening up allowed China and the U.S. to work through some of the most difficult and challenging problems in the relationship. But as much as the relationship has aided China in its process of reform and opening up, the experience of the past 40 years demonstrates that the greatest beneficiary of China's reform and opening up is China itself. The key question going forward in my mind is, how will China proceed on further reform and opening up? That's going to have a big impact not just on China's future economic growth, but also on the future trajectory of the U.S.-China relationship. There's been a huge effort in China to interpret the shift in U.S. policy, to try to understand why the Trump administration is putting so much pressure on China, especially in the area of trade and economics. Early on, some said in China it was all about President Trump trying to score political victories that he could tweet out to his base to show he's being tough on China. Sort of all about Trump's short-term politics. Others have said it's part of a long-term U.S. strategy to contain China, to undermine China's rise, and to change China's political system. I've even heard some in China recently say that it's all about the U.S. trying to shift the blame for its own domestic problems onto China, rather than trying to solve America's problems at home. What these interpretations or what these Chinese narratives don't do is acknowledge any role that Chinese policies or lack of reform efforts may have played in getting us to where we are today. And I think it's important for China to recognize concerns put forward by the Trump administration do represent legitimate grievances about China's economic and trade policies, practices in many cases which are deemed unfair and lacking in reciprocity, and concerns that are broadly shared by many in the global community. There's no doubt in my mind that the U.S.-China relationship is becoming more competitive. In some ways, that's an inevitable outcome of China's rise. China's more powerful today, it's more influential today. But just because we're going to compete more does not mean there's no room for cooperation. In fact, managing competition should be a major focus of our cooperation. We have to set ground rules for a new and more competitive relationship. We need to set the rules for competition. This is especially true in the area of technology. As the global community grapples to adapt and understand the implications of new technologies, China and the United States are going to need to work together to understand the potential consequences of these new technologies, which I don't think today we still fully understand. Short answer is no. Competition is going to become more prominent, and that will no doubt lead to clashes of interests. But clashes of interests do not suggest fundamental incompatibility. Nations' interests clash all the time. Competition is inevitable. The United States clashes with its allies and its adversaries alike. But in my mind, competition and cooperation are not mutually exclusive. In the long term, the common interests between China and the United States far outweigh the differences. I believe there's a need now to devise an updated framework for U.S.-China relations that manages the increased competition, reduces the risk of confrontation or conflict, and still facilitates cooperation that benefits both countries.